He thought money could replace love until the woman he left behind appeared in a hospital hallway carrying his child and a heartbreaking truth. This emotional story reminds us that pride can destroy the people we love most. If this story touched your heart, please support the channel with one like and one share so we can create more powerful stories for you. Thanks for watching.
Do you have any idea who I am? I could buy this entire hospital and just fire every last one of you. Charles Burden's voice roared through the lobby as he slammed his fist on the counter, his expensive watch cracking the marble. Sienna Vance, his mistress, just laughed, sliding a possessive hand down his chest. She cooed, "That's my man," and kissed his neck right there for everyone to see. But then the emergency doors flew open, and a gurney crashed past them. The dying pregnant woman on it turned her head, and Charles froze because those eyes, that face, gray with death, belonged to his ex-wife, Evelyn. Before we continue, I need you to do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. Go on, smash it, because this story is about to get unbelievable. I promise, you have to see how this plays out, and leave a comment telling me what city you're from. I'm curious to see just how far this story can travel. Now, let's get back to Charles, who is about to lose everything he ever cared about. The gurney rushed by so close, he could smell the sharp scent of antiseptic and sweat. And something else was in the air, a metallic smell, almost like fear. Evelyn's eyes, those green eyes he once knew better than his own, flickered toward him for a split second. There was no recognition, no anger, just raw, animal pain. And then she was gone, disappearing through another set of doors. Nurses were yelling medical terms he didn't understand. Machines beeped like a countdown. "Charles," his voice snapped him out of it. "Charles, what is wrong with you? You look like you just saw a ghost." He couldn't move. He couldn't even breathe. It felt like his lungs had shut down. "Sir." The receptionist was looking at him now, her irritation turning into genuine concern. "Sir, are you okay? Do you need to sit down?" "That woman," Charles heard himself say, his voice sounding like it was coming from far away. "The woman on that gurney. Who is she? What is wrong with her?" The receptionist glanced at her computer, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard. "I am sorry, sir. I can't release patient information. Her name is Evelyn Marsh," Charles interrupted, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "Evelyn Burden. She was my wife, my ex-wife. Is she what's happening to her?" Sienna's hand fell from his arm. "Wait, what? Your ex-wife? The one you told me was completely irrelevant? The one you said was in your past?" Charles barely registered her words. The receptionist was typing, her expression carefully neutral and professional. "Mr. Burden, if you are family, you need to speak with the doctor in charge, but I really can't. Is she dying?" The question tore from his throat, desperate and raw. "Just tell me if she is dying." A passing nurse stopped, her attention caught by the pure panic in his voice. She was older, with gray hair in a tight bun and eyes that had seen it all. She glanced at the receptionist, then at Charles, making a decision. "She's in critical condition," the nurse said softly. "Peripartum cardiomyopathy. Her heart is failing. They're trying to stabilize her right now." But she paused. "The baby is in distress, too. They may have to perform an emergency C-section." Each word was a punch to the gut. Heart failing. Baby. Emergency. Baby? Charles repeated, the word sounding foreign. "She's pregnant?" The nurse's face softened with pity. "You didn't know." Sienna let out a noise, somewhere between a shocked laugh and a gasp. "Oh my God, you have got to be kidding me, Charles. You brought me here while your pregnant ex-wife is literally dying next door? Are you out of your mind?" But Charles wasn't hearing her. He was counting backwards in his head, trying to pinpoint the last time he had truly seen Evelyn. Not just in a lawyer's office signing divorce papers. It must have been 8 months, maybe 9 months ago. The timeline was a complete blur, soaked in whiskey, late nights, and Sienna's apartment, all the ways he'd tried to forget her. "Whose baby is it?" The question came from Sienna, sounding sharp and jealous. For the first time since that gurney flew past, Charles turned and really looked at her, and it was like seeing a complete stranger. Her face was twisted into an ugly expression he'd never seen before. Maybe it was jealousy, or just the cold cruelty of someone who had never lost a single thing that mattered. "I don't know," he said, and the emptiness of not knowing hollowed out his chest. "You don't know?" Sienna's voice climbed higher. "You don't know if your ex-wife is having your baby, and you brought me to this hospital for what?" For my ridiculous spa appointment at the wellness center?
The receptionist cleared her throat.
Sir, ma'am, could you please keep your voices down? Don't you dare tell me to lower my voice. Sienna shot back. Do you have any clue who we are? Do you know the kind of money, Sienna? Charles' voice cut through her rant, flat and dead. Stop talking. She just stared at him, mouth open. Excuse me? I said, stop talking. He looked back at the older nurse, the one with the kind eyes. Where is she? Which floor? Third floor, maternity wing, the nurse answered. But sir, you can't just go. Charles was already moving, his expensive shoes echoing on the tile floor. His mind was racing, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would explode right out of his chest. Behind him, Sienna was shouting his name, her voice shrill and demanding, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. If he stopped, he felt like he might just shatter into a million pieces. The elevator doors slid open and he stepped inside, frantically pushing the button for the third floor. Just as the doors were closing, Sienna forced her way in. Her face was red, her eyes furious. You're actually going to her, she demanded. After everything she did? After she made your life miserable? Charles just stared at the numbers lighting up. She didn't leave me, he said softly. I left her. In every way that counts, I left her first. What are you even talking about? You said the marriage was over. You said she was cold and didn't understand you. You said I lied. The words escaped before he could stop them. I lied to you. I lied to myself. I was a coward, and I blamed her for my own problems, and instead of fighting for us, I just ran away. Sienna's mouth hung open. You can't be serious, Charles. You're throwing away everything we have for some woman who probably isn't even carrying your child. The elevator dinged. Third floor. The doors opened, and Charles stepped into a hallway that smelled of disinfectant and quiet panic. He could hear the beeping of machines and faint cries of babies down the hall. We don't have anything, Charles said, turning to face Sienna for the last time. We never did. I was just too selfish to admit it. He walked away without waiting for a reply, following signs to the maternity ward, his own pulse pounding in his ears. A nurse tried to stop him, asking who he was looking for, but he just pushed past her, frantically scanning the room numbers. And then he saw her through a small window in a door marked private, and his entire world spun. Evelyn was lying on a bed, tangled in wires and tubes, her skin a deathly gray. Her hair stuck to her forehead with sweat. Her eyes were closed. A doctor was shouting orders. The nurses were all moving with a practiced, urgent rhythm. The monitor by her bed was a blur of numbers that meant nothing to him, but everything to the team trying to save her. He pushed the door open without a second thought. Sir, you can't be in here, a nurse said, stepping in his way. I'm her husband, Charles blurted out, the lie automatic, before he corrected himself, forcing the truth out. Ex-husband. I'm the father. I think I might be the father. I have to be Mr. Burden. The doctor turned, her expression grim. Your name is listed as her emergency contact. We have been trying to call you. The words felt like a physical blow. Emergency contact. After all of it, after the bitter divorce, the separation, after he had cut her out of his life so completely, she had still listed him as the one person to call in an emergency. What's happening? Charles asked, his voice cracking. Is she going to make it? The doctor's face remained stone cold. Her heart is failing. This pregnancy put too much strain on it. We have to deliver the baby right now, but she's not stable. There are serious risks. What kind of risks? She might not survive the operation, the doctor said, with no attempt to soften the blow. Or the baby might not survive. Or we could lose them both. We need your consent to proceed, and we need it right now. Charles felt his legs give out. A nurse grabbed his arm, guiding him to a nearby chair. I can't. How am I supposed to make that choice? You don't, the doctor replied. Evelyn already made her wishes clear in her advance directive. If it comes to a choice, she wants us to save the baby. But we are going to do everything we can to save them both. I just need you to be prepared for what could happen. Save the baby. Not herself. The baby. Charles looked at Evelyn's still face, and something inside him finally broke. When did she get pregnant? Why didn't she ever tell him? Was she all alone this entire time? Carrying his child, if it even was his child, while dealing with a failing heart? Was she facing all this terror by herself while he was out playing the carefree billionaire with Sienna? Is it mine? The question came out as a raw, shameful whisper. The baby, is it mine? The doctor paused. A paternity test would confirm it, but her file says there's been no one else. You're the father. The whole room started spinning. Charles grabbed the chair, just trying to breathe, trying to think, trying to figure out how his perfectly controlled life had become this nightmare of beeping machines, a dying woman, and a baby who might never even draw a first breath. "Sir, we have to move now," the doctor said. "We're taking her to the operating room. You can wait in the family lounge. Someone will update you when we know something." They wheeled Evelyn's bed out, surrounded by staff and machines, a blur of organized chaos Charles couldn't even follow. He stood, tried to go after them, but a nurse gently held him back. "Let them work," she said softly. "You'll only be in their way." Charles just nodded, numb, and let her guide him down the hall to a small room with hard chairs, old magazines, and a TV playing the news on mute. He sat down, buried his head in his hands. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Charles Burden wept. He didn't hear Sienna walk in, didn't even know she was there until she started talking. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice completely cold, all the sweetness gone. "I'm leaving, and I am calling my lawyer. You made me look like a fool, Charles, in front of everyone, for some woman who obviously couldn't keep you happy." Charles looked up at her, his vision blurry, and for the first time, he saw her for who she really was. He saw the hardness in her eyes, the calculation. He realized she had been an escape, not a solution, just a beautiful distraction from the complete mess he'd made of his real life. "Go," he said. "Please, just go." She stared at him for a long moment, probably expecting him to take it back, to apologize, to beg. When he said nothing, she spun on her heel and left, her footsteps echoing down the hallway until they faded to nothing. Charles was alone. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen, at all the messages and emails from his other life, the life he was living while Evelyn was dying. Slowly, like a robot, he started scrolling back through his calendar, counting the days, trying to put the pieces together. 9 months ago, he'd gone back to their house one last time for some documents, and Evelyn had been there. They had fought, just like they always fought near the end, about everything and nothing: his work, his absence, his failure to ever just show up. And then, right in the middle of all that anger, something changed. They ended up in bed one last time. It was a desperate, grief-filled attempt to find each other again in the wreckage of their marriage. He left the next morning without even saying goodbye. The baby was his. He knew it deep in his bones, in the sick feeling in his gut. The baby was his, and Evelyn had been carrying him all alone, her heart giving out, her body breaking, and he'd been too busy playing king to even notice. A nurse appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Burton, would you like a cup of coffee? This could take a while." Charles just shook his head. "No, thank you. How long?" "It's hard to say. Maybe an hour, maybe more. The doctor will find you as soon as there's any news." The nurse left. Charles stood up and paced the tiny room, sat down, then stood up again. Time seemed to stretch and twist. Minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like seconds. He checked his phone constantly, not for messages, but just to watch the time, as if seeing the numbers change could speed things up. His mind would not shut off. He kept seeing Evelyn's face on that gurney, pale, sweating, fighting for her life. He kept hearing the doctor's words. She might not survive. He felt the weight of his own mistakes pressing down on him, suffocating him. He'd been so certain he was right. He was so sure the marriage failing had been her fault, that she was too demanding, too emotional, just too much. He'd told himself that leaving was the brave thing to do, that he deserved to be happy, deserved someone who understood him. Someone easy like Sienna, who never asked hard questions or expected him to be anything but rich and powerful. But sitting in that waiting room, wondering if his ex-wife and his unborn child would live or die, Charles finally understood the truth. He had been a coward. He'd run away from the only person who had ever truly known him, who'd seen past the money and the power to the scared, insecure man he was, and he'd punished her for it. He blamed her for making him feel vulnerable, for asking him to be more than just a bank account and a reputation. The door opened. Charles's head snapped up. It was the doctor, still in her scrubs, her mask hanging around her neck. Her face gave nothing away. Charles couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. His entire world had shrunk to this single moment, this woman and the news that would either save him or break him completely. "Mr. Burden," the doctor said, her voice now gentle, softer than before. "Evelyn made it through the surgery. The relief that washed over him was so intense it was almost painful. Charles's knees gave out again, and he had to grab a chair to stay on his feet. And the baby? The doctor gave a small smile. You have a son. He's small, but he's breathing on his own. The NICU team is with him, running tests, but so far, he's looking good. A son. Charles had a son. Can I see them? The words came out choked and desperate. Can I see Evelyn? Can I see my baby? Evelyn is in recovery. She's still unconscious, but she's stable. Her heart is doing better than we expected, but she will need very close monitoring and medication from now on. As for the baby, the doctor paused. He's in the NICU. You can see him, but you can't hold him yet. He has to stay in the incubator for now. Charles just nodded, not trusting his voice. The doctor watched him for a second. Mr. Burden, I don't know your history with Evelyn, but she went through hell today. When she wakes up, she is going to need support. Real support, not just someone showing up because they feel guilty. The words stung, because they were true. I understand, Charles said quietly. I'm not going anywhere, not this time. The doctor nodded, seemingly satisfied, and led him from the waiting room, down a maze of hallways, and through doors marked authorized personnel only deep into the maternity ward. The recovery room was quiet and dim. The only sound was the steady beeping of the monitors. Evelyn looked smaller than he remembered her, so fragile in that hospital bed. Her face was still pale, but it looked peaceful. An IV was in her arm, and wires connected her to machines that tracked her heart, her oxygen, her blood pressure. Charles walked toward her slowly, afraid to wake her, afraid she would see him and scream, afraid she would look at him with pure hatred. But she didn't stir. She just kept breathing, in and out, alive. He pulled a chair up to the bed and sat, his hands shaking. He wanted to reach out, to take her, to apologize for everything, but he knew he didn't have the right, not anymore. Maybe never again. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice cracking. I'm so sorry, Evelyn, for all of it, for leaving you, for not being here, for being such a coward. You deserved so much better. You always deserved better. She didn't move or respond. She just kept breathing. Charles sat there for a long time, watching her chest rise and fall, listening to the machines, and feeling his own guilt settle over him like a heavy blanket. He'd spent years building an empire, collecting out property and wealth and power, thinking that success was all about dollars and deals. But sitting there, next to the woman he had abandoned, the mother of his child, he finally understood what he had really lost. He'd lost everything that ever mattered. A soft knock on the door made him turn. A different nurse was standing there, younger, with a kind look on her face. Mr. Burden, if you'd like to see your son, I can take you to the NICU. Charles looked back at Evelyn one last time, then stood up, his body feeling heavy and tired. Yes, please. The NICU was completely overwhelming. There were rows of incubators, each holding a tiny, fragile baby, each one hooked up to a web of wires and tubes and monitors. The nurse led him to one in the corner, and Charles felt his breath catch in his throat. The baby was impossibly small. His skin was pink and wrinkled. His eyes were closed, and his tiny chest rose and fell with a steady rhythm. There was a tube in his nose and wires on his body, but he was alive. He was real. Can I? Charles's voice cracked. Can I touch him? The nurse nodded. You can put your hand through the porthole. Skin-to-skin contact is very good for him, even if you can't hold him. Charles carefully slid his hand through the opening, his fingers trembling as he gently rested his palm on his baby's chest. He was surprised by the warmth, by how real it felt. This tiny human, this little person who didn't exist 9 months ago, was half of him and half of Evelyn. He was everything Charles never even knew he wanted. Hey, little man, Charles whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm your dad. I know I don't really have the right to say that yet. I know I have messed up more than anyone ever should, but I am here now, and I am not going anywhere. I promise you that. I promise. The baby's tiny fingers twitched, as if he heard his voice, and that's when Charles finally broke down completely, his shoulders shaking as tears streamed down his face. The nurse quietly stepped back to give him some privacy, letting him fall apart in front of the son he so nearly never knew. Time just melted away. Charles had no idea how long he stood there, his hand on his son's chest, just feeling that tiny heartbeat and making promises he wasn't sure he knew how to keep. When he finally pulled his hand away and turned to leave, he saw her model, and there was Evelyn, awake, in a wheelchair in the doorway, with a nurse right behind her. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp, locked right on him. For a second, nobody moved. Nobody spoke a word. The air was just thick with everything they hadn't said, everything that was broken and could never be fixed. Then Evelyn spoke, her voice weak but clear. "His name is Rowan," she said. "Rowan Charles Marsh. And you don't get to be here, Charles. You don't get to just show up now and pretend that you care." Her words felt like a knife in his chest, sharp, precise, and completely deserved. "Evelyn, I know." She held up a hand, cutting him off. "You made your choice. You left. You moved on. You brought your mistress to the same hospital where I was literally dying. Do you have any idea how that felt? Do you have any clue what you've done?" Charles opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no defense, because she was right about everything. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling pathetic and small. "I know that doesn't mean a thing, but I am so sorry." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "Sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't give me back all the months I spent alone and terrified, thinking I was going to die before I even met my son. And sorry doesn't erase the fact that you chose someone else, over and over again, until there was nothing left of us." "I know," Charles said. "I know I destroyed everything, but please, just let me try to fix some of it. Let me be here for Rowan and for you. I want to do better. I have to do better." Evelyn just laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You want to do better now? After all this? You think you can just walk back in and play father because it's convenient for you? Because your guilt is eating you alive?" "It is not about guilt," Charles said, even though he knew that was only half true. "It's about," he stopped, searching for words that weren't there. "I love you, Evelyn. I never stopped loving you. I was just too stupid and too scared to admit it." She stared at him for a long moment, her face impossible to read. Then she slowly shook her head. "You don't get to say that to me. Not now. Not after everything." The nurse behind her cleared her throat. "Miss Marsh, you really should get some rest. The doctor said—" "I know what the doctor said." Evelyn's voice was hard now and final. "Take me back to my room and make sure he is not allowed in without my permission." "Evelyn, please." "Goodbye, Charles." She turned the wheelchair, let the nurse push her away, and she never looked back. Charles stood there in the NICU, surrounded by fragile new lives and beeping machines, and felt his own life completely shatter. He'd lost her. He had truly lost her. And this time, he had no idea if there was any way to ever get her back. Charles stood frozen in that hallway long after Evelyn was gone, the fluorescent lights buzzing over his head like a swarm of angry wasps. His phone kept vibrating in his pocket, but he couldn't bring himself to answer it. He couldn't do anything but stare at the empty space where she had been, where she'd looked at him with such pure hatred it had shattered every wall he'd ever built. A nurse gently touched his shoulder. "Sir, visiting hours are almost over. You'll need to leave the NICU soon." He just nodded, turned mechanically, and walked back to the incubator where Rowan was sleeping. His son. The words felt alien in his mind, like a language he'd never spoken. He pressed his palm against the clear plastic, watching that tiny chest rise and fall, and felt something inside him crack even deeper. "I'll be back," he whispered. "I promise you, little man. I am going to figure this out." But as he left the hospital and walked into the parking garage, the cold Seattle air hitting his face like a slap, Charles knew he had no idea how to figure any of it out. His whole life was built on control, on making calculated moves and never letting his emotions get in the way of his judgment. And now, everything was raw emotion, bleeding out, and impossible to ignore. His phone buzzed again, 14 missed calls, 23 texts. He scrolled through them with numb fingers. Sienna was demanding to know where he was, threatening him with lawyers, calling him every name in the book. His business partner, Marcus Chen, was asking if he was still coming to the board meeting tomorrow. His assistant, Jennifer, was forward urgent contracts that he needed to sign. Charles just deleted them all without a single reply. He got into his Tesla, a car that cost more than most people make in 2 years, and just sat there. His hands gripped the steering wheel, but he didn't start the engine. He couldn't even remember where he was supposed to drive. To the penthouse downtown, where Sienna's stuff was all over his Italian marble counters. Or the office, where 1,000 problems were waiting for him. None of it felt real. His phone rang. It was Marcus. Charles almost ignored it, but for some reason he answered, "Where the hell are you?" Marcus's voice was sharp and annoyed. The Bellingham deal closes in 18 hours and you haven't signed the final terms. Our lawyers are going crazy over here. I'm at the hospital, Charles said, his voice completely flat. What, are you sick? Charles, this is not the time to my ex-wife almost died today. The words came out cold and disconnected. She was pregnant with my son. She had to have emergency surgery. Her heart was failing. There was silence on the other end. Then Marcus spoke carefully. I didn't even know you had a son. Neither did I. More silence. Marcus cleared his throat. Okay, that's heavy. But Charles, listen to me, I need you to focus. The Bellingham deal is worth $42 million. We can't. You handle it. What? You heard me. Handle it or don't. I don't care. Charles hung up before Marcus could say another word. He turned off his phone and finally started the car. He drove without thinking, letting muscle memory guide him through familiar streets, until he realized he was heading toward Ballard, the neighborhood where he and Evelyn had lived together before it all fell apart. He hadn't been back there in more than a year. In fact, he'd actively avoided it, even hiring movers to pack his things so he wouldn't have to see the house again. But now here he was, pulling up across the street, just staring at the two-story Craftsman with its blue-gray paint and white trim. The porch light was out. The garden Evelyn had adored was overgrown and neglected. A for sale sign stood crooked in the yard. She was selling the house. Of course she was. She probably needed the money for medical bills, for the baby, for all the things Charles should have been taking care of if he hadn't been so busy being king of his own little empire. He got out of the car, walked up to the porch, and just stood there like a fool because he didn't have a key anymore. He had no right to go inside. But the door was unlocked, and that stopped him cold. Evelyn never, ever left doors unlocked. She was paranoid about security, always double-checking every lock and window before going to bed. Charles pushed the door open slowly. Hello? Is anyone here? No answer. The house was dark, quiet, and smelled of dust and neglect. He flicked on a light and immediately regretted it. The living room was a complete disaster. Medical bills were scattered all over the coffee table, some stamped with past due in bright red ink. Empty takeout boxes were piled up in the kitchen. A breast pump was sitting on the counter, still in its box. Baby books had little notes sticking out, marking pages about heart conditions and premature births. The whole place screamed of Evelyn trying to get ready for a baby while her own body was shutting down. She was trying to do everything all alone because Charles had made it perfectly clear she meant nothing to him. He picked up one of the medical bills. $15,000 for a cardiac consultation.
Another one was $28,000 for an echocardiogram. Insurance covered some.
But the leftover balances were huge, and these were just the ones she hadn't filed away. Charles's phone was off, so he couldn't call his accountant or transfer money right away, but he made a mental note and started stacking the bills, putting them in order by date and amount. It was something he could fix. At least money was something he could understand. A sound from upstairs made him freeze. Footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps, right from the bedroom. Charles's heart started pounding in his chest. Someone was in the house. A burglar maybe. Or someone who saw the for sale sign and just assumed the place was empty. He grabbed a fire poker from the fireplace and crept toward the stairs, adrenaline surging through him. I'm calling the police, he yelled, his voice sounding braver than he felt. You have 10 seconds to get out of here. The footsteps stopped. Then a woman's voice, familiar but not Evelyn's, called down. Charles, is that you? He relaxed a little, lowering the poker. Diane, Evelyn's sister, appeared at the top of the stairs. Her face was pale, and her eyes were red from crying. She was holding a cardboard box full of baby clothes, tiny onesies, and blankets, all with the tags still on. What are you doing here? Her voice was cold and full of accusation. I could ask you the same thing. Diane walked down the stairs slowly, as if she were approaching a wild animal. When she got to the bottom, she set the box down hard and crossed her arms. I'm packing up Evelyn's things. She asked me to, since she is, stuck in a hospital, recovering from nearly dying. The words were like bullets. Charles flinched. I was at the hospital. I saw her. Yeah, I heard. Diane's laugh was bitter. You and your mistress made quite a scene, from what the nurses told me. Real classy, Charles. Bringing your new girlfriend to the same building where your ex-wife was coding on an operating table. It wasn't I didn't know she was there. We were there for something else entirely. And then he stopped, realizing how pathetic that sounded. How is she, really? The doctor said she was stable, but what you want details so you can feel better about yourself. Diane's voice rose. She almost died, Charles. Do you understand that? Her heart was at 20% function. 20%. They had to deliver Rowan 5 weeks early because waiting any longer would have killed her. And you know what she was worried about when she woke up? Not herself. Not whether she'd survive. She was asking if the baby was okay, if he was breathing, if he was healthy. That's the kind of person she is, and you threw her away like garbage. Charles opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no defense because there was none. Diane picked up the box again and headed toward the front door. You need to leave. You're not welcome here. Wait. Charles moved to block her path. Please. I know I don't deserve anything, but I need to know. When did she find out about the pregnancy, about her heart? Diane stared at him for a long, heavy moment. At last, she sighed. She found out she was pregnant about 2 weeks after you moved out. She went to the doctor thinking she just had the flu. They did an ultrasound, and there he was, Rowan, a little blob on a screen that changed everything. The news made Charles feel sick. Evelyn started showing symptoms around month 4. Shortness of breath, feeling tired all the time, chest pains. She just ignored it at first, figuring it was normal pregnancy stuff. But by the 6th month, she collapsed at work and ended up in the emergency room. That's when they diagnosed her with cardiomyopathy. Diane's voice cracked. They told her she might not survive a full-term pregnancy, that she should consider ending it for her own safety. And you know what she said? Charles shook his head, not trusting his own voice. She said no. She said this baby was all she had left of the life she'd planned, and she wasn't giving up on him. So she spent the last 3 months basically on bed rest, monitoring her heart, taking medications that made her sick, and preparing to die so her baby could live. Diane wiped her eyes roughly. And where were you? On yachts with Sienna? At galas, making Forbes lists? Living your best life while Evelyn was writing goodbye letters to a son she thought she'd never meet? The words destroyed him. Charles leaned against the wall, feeling his legs go weak. I didn't know. If you had known, what would you have done? Come running back to play the hero? You made it very clear you wanted nothing to do with her, Charles. Your lawyers made sure the divorce went through as fast as legally possible. You blocked her number. You returned her emails unread. What was she supposed to do? Show up at your office with an ultrasound photo and beg you to care? She could have tried. Even as he said it, Charles knew it was wrong. He knew he had no right to demand anything. Diane's expression turned to pure disgust. She did try. She called you 3 times in the first trimester. You never answered. She sent you 1 email, just 1, saying she needed to talk to you about something important. You had your assistant reply with a cease and desist letter, threatening harassment charges if she contacted you again. The memory hit Charles like a truck. He had been at dinner with Sienna, annoyed by the interruption, convinced Evelyn was just trying to drag him back into some drama. He told Jennifer to handle it, to make it clear that he'd moved on. He thought he was being strong, setting boundaries. He had been a monster. Oh, God, he whispered. I told Jennifer to... I didn't even read it. I just assumed. You assumed she was the problem, like you always did. Diane pushed past him and carried the box to her car parked in the driveway. When she came back, she looked tired and defeated. Look, I do not know what you want here. Absolution? Permission to feel bad? You are not going to get it from me. The only person who can decide whether you get a second chance is Evelyn, and right now, she does not even want to see your face. I know. Charles straightened up, trying to pull himself together, but I'm not giving up. I can't. That's my son in there, and that's... He stopped, the truth forcing itself out. That's the woman I love. I know I destroyed everything. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm going to spend every day for the rest of my life trying to make this right. Diane studied him with hard eyes. Pretty words, Charles. But Evelyn's heard plenty of pretty words from you before. She needs action, consistency, proof that you have actually changed, and not that you are just feeling guilty because the situation got real. Then tell me what to do. Please, tell me how to fix this. I cannot tell you that. You have to figure it out yourself. That is the whole point. Dan grabbed another box from the living room, this one filled with books and framed photos. But I will tell you this. If you hurt her again, if you make promises you do not keep, if you show up for a week and then disappear back into your billionaire bubble, I will personally destroy you. I do not care how much money you have or how many lawyers you can afford. I will make your life a living hell. Are we clear? Crystal clear. Diane nodded and carried the box out. Charles watched her load it into her car, then went back inside the house. He couldn't leave yet. He couldn't walk away without doing something, even if it was small, even if it didn't matter. He started cleaning. He took all the takeout containers to the garbage, washed the dishes piled in the sink, and organized the medical bills into a folder. He found Evelyn's checkbook and saw the balance, $462, and felt like someone had punched him in the gut. She had been living on nothing, surviving on nothing, while he'd spent more than that on a single dinner with Sienna. He moved upstairs and found the nursery Evelyn had started setting up. A crib still in its box, a changing table partially assembled, paint swatches taped to the wall, soft greens and blues. Nothing gendered, just peaceful. A rocking chair with a pillow that said, "Hello, world," embroidered on it. Charles sat in that rocking chair and put his head in his hands and finally, truly let himself feel the full weight of what he had done. Not just to Evelyn, but to himself, to the life they could have had, to Rowan, who deserved a father who showed up, who fought, who did not run away. The second things got difficult. He pulled out his phone and turned it back on. Immediately, it started buzzing with notifications, but he ignored them all except one. He found his accountant's number and sent a text. Need an emergency wire transfer. Every medical bill associated with Evelyn Marsh paid in full immediately. No spending limit. Handle it tonight. Then he called his lawyer, the one who had handled the divorce, the one who sent that cease and desist letter to Evelyn. The call went to voicemail. Charles left a message, his voice rough. "Richard, it's Charles Burton. I need you to draw up new documents. I want Evelyn Marsh added to all my accounts with full access. I want her as beneficiary on everything: life insurance, properties, investments, all of it. And I want a trust set up for Rowan, fully funded. Education covered through graduate school, healthcare covered indefinitely. I want it done by tomorrow morning. Call me when it's ready to sign." He hung up and stared at the phone. It wasn't enough. Money didn't fix betrayal, but it was a start. Diane appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing?" "Trying to help by throwing money at the problem." "Is that your solution?" But her voice was softer now, less cutting. "It's not a solution. It's what I can do right now. I can make sure she never has to worry about bills or insurance or whether she can afford Rowan's care. I can take that stress away, at least." Diane was quiet for a moment. "She will not accept it. You know that, right? She is too proud. Then I'll pay the bills directly. Set up automatic transfers. She does not have to know it is from me." Charles stood up and faced Evelyn's sister. "I'm not trying to buy her back. I just want her to be able to focus on getting better and taking care of Rowan without drowning in debt." Something shifted in Diane's expression. Not forgiveness, but maybe the smallest crack in her armor. "Fine, but do not you dare use this as leverage. Don't show up at the hospital waving paid bills in her face like you are some kind of savior. You do this quietly, or you do not do it at all." Agreed. They stood there in the half-finished nursery, surrounded by all the things Evelyn had prepared alone, all the hope and fear packed into baby clothes and paint swatches. Finally, Diane spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "She loved you, you know. Even after everything, even when she should have hated you. She kept your favorite coffee mug, couldn't bring herself to throw it away." She pointed to a shelf where a chipped blue mug sat, the one Charles had used every morning for 5 years. That is the kind of person she is. She holds on, even when it hurts. So if you are going to do this, if you are really going to try to make things right, you better be ready to match that level of commitment, because halfway is not going to cut it. Charles picked up the mug and ran his thumb over the chip on the rim. He remembered the day it happened, dropping it in the sink, and Evelyn laughing and saying it gave it character. He remembered lazy Sunday mornings with coffee in bed, her head on his shoulder, talking about dreams they had never gotten around to chasing. "I'm ready," he said, and he meant it. Diane left a few minutes later with the last box. Charles stayed until dawn, finishing the nursery, assembling the crib, the changing table, and a mobile with little moons and stars that played a soft lullaby. He hung curtains, organized drawers with the tiny clothes Diane left, and painted a wall the soft green Evelyn chose. He worked in careful strokes, trying to make everything perfect. As the sun rose, painting the room gold, Charles stepped back to see what he had done. It wasn't much, just a room, some basic furniture, and a fresh coat of paint. But it was something Evelyn wouldn't have to face alone, something Rowan could come home to. He cleaned up, locked the house, and drove back to the hospital. It was barely 6 in the morning, but the place was buzzing. Nurses changed shifts, carts rattled down hallways, and machines hummed, keeping people alive. Charles went right to the NICU, signed in, and scrubbed hands arms, just like they showed him. Rowan was awake this time, his tiny eyes open, unfocused, but searching. Charles slid his hand through the porthole and touched his son's impossibly small fingers. "Hey, buddy, it's Dad. I was here last night, but you were sleeping. I finished your room, painted it green like your mom wanted. I put your crib together. It's not fancy, but it's solid, safe, everything you need." He paused, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry I wasn't there before. I'm sorry I didn't know about you. But I'm here now. I'm going to figure out how to be the father you deserve. I promise you that." Rowan's fingers curled just slightly around Charles's thumb. The grip was weak, instinctive, but it felt like an anchor, like the only real thing in his entire life. A voice behind him made him turn. It was a NICU nurse, different from last night, smiling gently. "He's doing really well. His oxygen levels are stable. We might take him off the monitors in a few days if he keeps this up." "That's good," Charles said. "That's really good. And his mother, Evelyn, have you heard how she's doing?" The nurse's expression changed, becoming more guarded. "She's stable. They moved her to a regular room this morning, but she left specific instructions that you are not allowed to visit without her permission." The words stung, but Charles just nodded. "I understand. Can you at least tell her I was here? That I am asking about her? I can do that." Charles spent another hour with Rowan, talking about nothing and everything, making promises he wasn't sure how to keep, but was desperate to try. Then he made himself leave, go back to his car, and face the life he'd built, a life that now felt like a prison. His phone had 53 new messages. Charles scrolled through them, deleting most, but one from Marcus made him stop cold. "Board meeting happening now without you. Vote on the Bellingham deal in 30 minutes. If you're not here, we are moving forward with or without your approval. Your absence is noted and will be addressed." Charles stared at the text. $42 million. A deal he'd spent 8 months building. His biggest acquisition of the year, the kind of move that would cement his reputation and expand his empire, proving he was still on top. He deleted the message and turned his phone off again. Then he drove back to Ballard, parked outside Evelyn's house, and started working on the overgrown garden she'd loved, pulling weeds as the sun rose, his expensive suit getting dirty, his hands blistering, not caring about anything except making one small thing better. Charles was on his knees in the dirt, pulling weeds from Evelyn's rose bushes, when a black Mercedes pulled up. He didn't have to look up to know who it was. Marcus's car had a specific engine sound, a smooth German purr that screamed wealth and impatience. The car door slammed, footsteps on the sidewalk, quick and angry. "Are you out of your mind?" Marcus's voice sliced through the morning air. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Charles kept pulling weeds, his hands raw and bleeding from thorns he didn't bother to avoid. "I'm working, Marcus. As you can see, working." "You call this working?" Marcus gestured to the garden, to Charles's ruined suit, to the whole bizarre scene. "You just cost us the Bellingham deal, $42 million, Charles. The board voted without you and they killed it. They said if you couldn't bother to show up, it must not be worth it." "Good." Marcus stopped dead. "Good? Did you just say good?" The Bellingham property was overvalued. The environmental reports were a mess. We would have been buying a lawsuit waiting to happen. Charles finally looked up, squinting into the sun. "You know that as well as I do. We were only pushing it because it looked good on paper. Since when do you care more about looking good on paper than actually making money?" Marcus ran a hand through his hair, totally frustrated. "Charles, what is happening to you? You've been missing for 2 days. You're not answering calls. You're ignoring urgent business. And now I find you here doing yard work in a $3,000 suit like you've completely lost your mind." Charles stood up slowly, his knees aching. He was 46 years old and was feeling every single year. "I haven't lost my mind. I'm just starting to find it." "That's cryptic and not helpful," Marcus said, crossing his arms. "Look, I get it. You had a shock. Your ex-wife, the baby, it's all heavy. But you can't just abandon everything you've built over one crisis. You have responsibilities, people who depend on you." "Name one person who actually depends on me," Charles said quietly. "One person whose life would be truly worse if I disappeared tomorrow." Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. He tried again. "Your employees, the company, your investors, they'd replace me in a week. You know it. The company basically runs itself now. I'm just a name on letterhead, a signature on contracts." Charles picked up a rake, starting to gather the weeds into a pile. "But my son, that little boy in the hospital, he actually needs me. And Evelyn, whether she admits it or not, she needs real support, not just money thrown at her problems." "So, what now? You're going to become a gardener, a stay-at-home dad?" Marcus's tone was teasing, but there was something else underneath. Maybe concern, or the fear that Charles was actually having a breakdown. "I don't know what I'm going to become. I just know I can't be what I was." Charles stopped raking and met his friend's eyes. "I was a terrible husband. I'm starting from zero as a father. And the business, the empire, all of it is hollow. Did you ever wake up and realize you've spent 20 years building something that doesn't really matter?"
"Every single day," Marcus said so quietly. Charles almost missed it.
"But we do not talk about it. We just keep building because that is what we do." They stood there in the overgrown garden, two men in expensive suits, surrounded by weeds and broken dreams. And for a moment, Charles saw his business partner clearly for the first time in years. Marcus was also divorced 3 times, actually. His kids were grown and barely talked to him. He lived alone in a penthouse twice the size of Charles's, filled with art he never looked at and furniture nobody ever sat on. "Come with me," Charles said suddenly. "What?" "To the hospital. Come meet Rowan. See what actually matters." Marcus laughed, uncomfortable. "Charles, I do not do babies. You know that. I'm not good with that kind of thing." "Neither am I, but I am learning." Charles took off his dirty suit jacket and tossed it on the porch. "Come on, 20 minutes. If you still think I'm crazy after that, fine. I will sign whatever papers you need, make whatever appearances, but just come see him first." Marcus looked at his watch, at his car, then at Charles, who was standing there covered in dirt and looking more alive than he had in years. Finally, he sighed. 20 minutes. That is it. They took Marcus's Mercedes because Charles's Tesla was blocked in. The drive to the hospital was quiet and tense. Marcus kept checking his phone, answering emails, doing business like he always did. Charles just stared out the window, watching Seattle pass by, thinking of all the time he'd wasted living exactly like Marcus was right now. At the hospital, Charles led Marcus through the maze of hallways to the NICU. They scrubbed in and put on the required gowns and masks. Marcus looked incredibly uncomfortable and out of place, like he'd been dropped into a foreign country where he didn't speak the language. "This is weird," Marcus muttered. "I feel weird." "It's supposed to feel weird. You're about to meet a human who is less than 48 hours old and weighs 4 pounds. Charles stopped at Rowan's incubator, feeling his heart do that strange flip it did every time he saw his son. "Marcus, meet Rowan." "Rowan, this is my friend Marcus, who thinks I am having a breakdown." Marcus stepped closer and peered through the clear plastic at the tiny baby sleeping inside. His expression shifted, softening in a way Charles had never seen before. "Oh," Marcus said, "just that." "Oh, yeah," Charles agreed. They stood there for a long moment watching Rowan sleep, watching his tiny chest rise and fall, his little fingers twitching in his dreams. Then Marcus cleared his throat, stepped back and pulled off his mask. His eyes were wet. "Okay," he said, his voice rough. "Okay, I get it." "Yeah? Yeah." Marcus looked right at Charles. "Take whatever time you need. I will handle the board. I will handle the business. You focus on this, on him, on fixing things with your ex-wife if you can. Just like that? Just like that." Marcus headed for the exit, then stopped and turned back. "For what it is worth, you are not having a breakdown. You are having a breakthrough. They look similar from the outside, but they are not the same thing at all." He left before Charles could even respond. Charles turned back to Rowan, sliding his hand through the porthole to touch his son's warm skin. "You're good at this," he whispered. "Changing minds. That's a useful skill. Your old dad could have used that about 20 years ago." A nurse, the same kind one from the first day, approached. "Mr. Burton, there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent." Charles's first thought was Sienna, coming to make another scene. His second was his lawyer, though Richard usually called. But when he walked into the family waiting area, he found someone he never expected. Jennifer, his assistant, stood there in her perfect business clothes, clutching her tablet like armor, but her face was blotchy, her eyes were red, and when she saw Charles, she burst into tears. "Jennifer, what's wrong? What happened?" "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Burton. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Charles led her to a chair and handed her a tissue. "Didn't know what, Jennifer? Take a breath, tell me what's going on." She wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself, but failed. "The email from your ex-wife, the one you told me to handle with a cease and desist letter. I read it this morning. I mean, I saw it back then, but I didn't really read it. I just saw she was contacting you after the divorce and followed your instructions to make it stop. But this morning, I was going through old files, saw it again, and actually read it. And she broke down again. She was trying to tell you about the baby, about being pregnant. She was asking for help." The words hit Charles like a physical blow. He sat down hard in the chair next to Jennifer, feeling the world spin. "What did it say exactly?" Jennifer pulled out her tablet with shaking hands, opened an email, and read it in a whisper. "Charles, I know you don't want to hear from me. I know you've moved on, and I respect that. But I need to tell you something important. I'm pregnant. It's yours. There is no doubt about that. I am not asking you to come back or change your life. I just thought you should know that you're going to be a father. If you want to be involved, please call me. If not, I understand. But either way, this baby deserves to know the truth someday. Take care of yourself, Evelyn." Charles put his head in his hands. She had tried. She had reached out, given him a chance, and he'd shut her down with legal threats. He'd made sure she could never contact him again. He had pushed away the mother of his child when she was scared and alone and trying to do the right thing. "I'm sorry," Jennifer said again. "I should have told you what was in the email. I should have insisted you read it yourself. I was just following your instructions to keep her away from you, to protect you from drama. But I was wrong. I was so wrong." "No," Charles said, his voice hollow. "You were doing your job. I was the one who was wrong. I created a situation where everyone around me knew not to bother me with Evelyn's name. I trained all of you to treat her like she didn't matter. This is on me, not you." Jennifer stood up abruptly. "I'm quitting. I can't work for you anymore. Not after this. I enabled something terrible, and I can't look at myself in the mirror if I keep enabling it." "Jennifer, wait, please." Charles stood too, catching her arm gently. "Don't quit. I need you. But I need you to do something different now." She looked at him, exhausted. "What? I need you to help me make this right. Help me figure out how to be present for my son and for Evelyn. Help me restructure my life so business isn't the only thing in it. Can you do that?" Jennifer studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the truth. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, but I'm doing it for that baby and for your ex-wife, not for you." "Fair enough." She left, still crying, but with her shoulders a little straighter, and Charles went back to the NICU. Rowan was awake now, his eyes open and unfocused, his tiny mouth working like he was trying to figure out what it was for. Charles stood there watching him, memorizing every detail, trying to burn the image into his brain so he'd never forget what truly mattered. "Mr. Burton." Another nurse, a younger one this time, approached with a smile. "Good news. Ms. Marsh is asking for you." Charles, as his heart stopped. "Evelyn? She wants to see me? She wants to see Rowan, but she said you could be there too, if you promise to behave yourself." The nurse's smile widened. Her words, not mine. They wheeled Rowan's entire incubator setup down the hall. It was a complicated operation that took 3 nurses and a lot of careful maneuvering. Charles followed like a shadow, terrified and hopeful, and completely out of his element. They entered Evelyn's room, and Charles felt his chest clench tight. She looked better than the last time he'd seen her. Color in her face, sitting up in bed, wearing a hospital gown but somehow still dignified. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, with no makeup. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Her eyes met his and held. "Hello, Charles." "Hello, Evelyn." His voice came out rough and uncertain. She didn't smile, didn't soften her expression, just watched him with those green eyes that had always seen too much. "The nurses tell me you've been here every day, sitting with Rowan, talking to him." "I have. They also tell me someone paid all my medical bills, every single one, and set up a trust fund for Rowan and tried to put money in my bank account, which I rejected." Her voice was carefully neutral. "That was you." Charles nodded. "I'm not trying to buy anything. I just wanted to help." "Help?" Evelyn repeated the word like it was from another language. "You want to help now after everything? I know I don't deserve—" "Stop." She held up a hand. "Don't tell me what you don't deserve. I know exactly what you don't deserve. What I need to know is why you're here, really here. Is it guilt? Is it some midlife crisis thing where you suddenly want to play daddy because it seems meaningful? Is it because Sienna dumped you?" "I dumped Sienna," Charles said quietly. "Or she dumped me. I don't know. It doesn't matter. She was never what I wanted. She was just what I was using to avoid facing what I had destroyed." Evelyn's expression flickered, something painful crossing her face. "And what did you destroy, Charles? Say it out loud." "Oos." The word came out broken. "I destroyed us, our marriage, our future. I destroyed the best thing I ever had because I was too much of a coward to fight for it." "Why?" The question was soft but devastating. "Why did you give up on us? I've spent 2 years trying to understand it, and I can't. We had problems, sure. Every marriage does. But they weren't unfixable. We could have gone to therapy. We could have talked. Instead, you just left, checked out emotionally, and then physically. Started seeing Sienna before the divorce was even final. So, tell me why, Charles. Tell me what I did that was so terrible you couldn't stand being married to me anymore." Tears were streaming down Charles's face, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. "You didn't do anything. It was all me. You wanted me to be vulnerable, to open up, to actually feel things instead of just managing them. And I couldn't. Every time you asked how I was really doing, every time you tried to get me to talk, I felt like I was failing, like I wasn't man enough or successful enough because I had doubts and fears. So, you left instead of admitting you were human." Yes. The admission cost him everything. I left because staying meant being honest, and being honest meant being vulnerable, and being vulnerable meant I might lose control, and control was all I had, or all I thought I had. Evelyn was crying now, 2 silent tears running down her cheeks. "You're an idiot." "I know. A complete and total idiot. I know. I loved you." Her voice broke on the words. "I loved you so much it hurt. I would have done anything to make our marriage work. Anything, but you wouldn't even try. You just gave up and blamed me for it. I'm sorry." Charles dropped to his knees beside her bed, not caring how it looked, not caring about anything except making her understand. "I am so sorry, Evelyn, for all of it. For leaving. For not being there when you were pregnant and scared. For making you face everything alone. For being too broken to see what I was throwing away until it was almost too late." She looked down at him, her face a mess of tears and anger, and something that might have been hope. "Almost too late? You think it's not too late?" "I don't know," Charles said honestly. "Maybe it is. Maybe I've destroyed any chance we had. But I'm here now. I'm going to be here for Rowan whether you want me to or not. I'm going to show up every single day. I am going to learn how to be a father. And if somewhere in all of that you decide you and I can, maybe, possibly, someday forgive me, then I will spend the rest of my life proving I've changed." Evelyn didn't respond. She just looked at him for a long moment, then looked at Rowan in his incubator, at their son sleeping peacefully despite all the adult drama swirling around him. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I am not ready to forgive you. I don't know if I'll ever be ready, but I'm willing to let you try. For Rowan's sake, he deserves to know his father." She paused. "But, Charles, if you hurt him, if you disappoint him, if you make promises you don't keep, I will make sure you never see him again. Legal or not, I will find a way. Do you understand me?" "I understand. Then you can stay for now. But you're on thin ice. One mistake, and it's over." Charles nodded and got up, moving toward a chair in the corner, but Evelyn stopped him. "Not there. Here." She patted the spot on the bed next to her. "If we're really going to do this, if we're going to co-parent, we need to actually talk. So, sit down and tell me about this nursery Diane keeps talking about." Charles sat down carefully on the bed's edge, leaving a deliberate space between them. Then, haltingly and a little awkwardly, he began talking. He described painting the walls, putting the crib together, and choosing the mobile with moons and stars. It reminded him of a camping trip from years ago when they'd laid in a tent, stared at the sky, and dreamed of having kids someday. Evelyn listened, her face impossible to read. Sometimes she'd ask a question. Sometimes she'd cry, and once she almost smiled. Slowly, the gap between them on the bed began to close. They were still sitting there, talking and crying, starting the hard work of rebuilding from the ashes. Then Rowan started crying from his incubator, a tiny, fragile sound that made them both freeze. "Can I?" Charles asked. "Not yet. He has to stay in there." But Evelyn reached through an opening and touched Rowan's chest. Her hand was right beside his. Their fingers brushed, and for a moment neither of them moved. "Hey, baby boy," Evelyn cooed. "Mom is here, and Daddy's here too. We've got you. You're safe now. You are so loved. Everything is going to be okay." Charles wasn't sure if that was true. He didn't know if anything would ever be okay again. But sitting there with Evelyn's hands next to his and their son between them, he felt something he hadn't felt for years. Hope. That small moment of peace lasted for exactly 47 seconds before Evelyn's heart monitor started screaming. The alarm was a shrill, violent sound that sliced through the quiet room. Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her chest as her face turned a pale gray. Charles shot to his feet, pure panic washing over him as nurses burst into the room. "What's happening?" he yelled. "What's wrong with her?" "Sir, please step back." A nurse pushed him away, checking the monitors and pressing buttons. "Miss Marsh, can you hear me? Are you having chest pain?" Evelyn could only nod, unable to speak, her breathing shallow and fast. Another nurse was paging a doctor on the intercom, calling out urgent codes Charles didn't recognize. No. He tried to get closer, but someone held him back. "Evelyn, look at me. You're okay." But she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on Rowan, filled with terror, her lips moving silently. Charles knew. She was saying goodbye. She honestly thought she was dying. The surgeon from before rushed in, glanced at the monitors, and started yelling orders. "Get me an EKG now. Prepare for cardiac intervention. Somebody get him out of here." "I am not leaving," Charles said, his voice cracking. "I am not leaving her again." "Then stay out of the way." The doctor had no time to argue. She was busy trying to save Evelyn's life. Charles stumbled back into a corner, watching helplessly as the medical team swarmed around Evelyn, attaching more wires and injecting medicines with an urgent, practiced calm. Rowan began to cry again in his incubator, reacting to the sudden chaos. Charles felt like he was being torn in two. His son needed him, and his ex-wife was dying. He couldn't help either of them. "Charles." Evelyn's voice, though weak and thin, somehow cut right through the noise. "Charles, if I don't you dare." Charles interrupted, pushing past a nurse to grab her hand. "Don't you dare say goodbye to me. You are going to be fine. You'll be fine, and we are going to take Rowan home and figure all of this out. Together. Promise me." She squeezed his hand with the last of her strength. "Promise me you'll take care of him. That you won't let him think he wasn't wanted. That you'll tell him about me, about us, about I'm not promising anything because you are going to do it yourself." Charles was crying openly now, not caring who saw. You're going to be there for his first word, his first step, his first day of school, and everything else. Do you hear me? You don't get to leave me. I won't let you. The doctor was staring at the EKG results, her face grim, her heart's in arrhythmia. "We need to cardiovert. Clear the room. Non-essentials only." "I am essential," Charles said, standing his ground. "Sir, if you don't leave this instant, I will have security remove you." The doctor's voice was like steel. "You want to help her? Then get out of my way and let me do my job." A nurse gently took Charles's arm and pulled him toward the door. He let her lead him, but his eyes never left Evelyn, the woman he had loved, lost, found again, and might now lose forever. At the doorway, he stopped and looked back. "Fight," he said. Just that one word. "Please, fight." Evelyn's eyes met his for a split second, and then the door shut, leaving Charles alone in the hallway. The sounds from the other side of the wall were driving him crazy. He paced, he sat, he stood up, he paced some more. His mind was a tornado of every terrible possibility. Evelyn dying, Rowan growing up without his mother, Charles trying to raise a son alone when he couldn't even change a diaper, and it was all his fault. All of it was his fault, because he was too much of a coward to love her the right way when he had the chance. Suddenly, Diane appeared, running down the hall, her face pale. What happened? The nurse called me. She said it was Evelyn's heart. They're working on her, Charles said, his own voice sounding dead to him. Her heart went into arrhythmia. They're trying to fix it. Diane's legs just buckled. She slid down the wall to the floor and buried her head between her knees. She can't die. She can't. She fought so hard to have Rowan. She fought so hard to stay alive. She just can't die now. Charles sat on the cold hospital floor beside her, the two of them waiting for news that could shatter their world. Time seemed to warp. 5 minutes felt like 5 hours. 10 minutes felt like a decade. Finally, the door creaked open. The doctor came out, pulling off her gloves, her face showing pure exhaustion. Charles and Diane scrambled to their feet. She's stable, the doctor said, and Charles felt his knees almost give out from relief. We got her heart rhythm back to normal, but this was a serious event. Her heart is weaker than we realized. The pregnancy caused more damage than our first scans were able to show. What does that mean? Diane asked. For the long term, it means she needs constant monitoring, new medications, no stress, and a lot of rest. And the doctor hesitated. It means she might not make a full recovery. Some cases of this condition, peripartum cardiomyopathy, get better over time. Others don't. We won't know which group she is in for at least a few months. Can we see her? Charles asked. 5 minutes. She needs to rest. And I mean real rest, not emotional conversations that will spike her heart rate. The doctor gave Charles a very pointed look. Whatever is going on between you two needs to be calm and steady from now on. Her life literally depends on it. They walked in together, Diane going first while Charles hung back a little. Evelyn looked so small in that big bed, hooked up to even more machines now, but her eyes were open and they were clear. She gave her sister a weak smile. Still here, she said, her voice raspy. Can't get rid of me that easily. Diane burst into tears, grabbing Evelyn's hand and pressing it to her forehead. Don't you ever scare me like that again. Do you hear me? Never again. I'll try. Evelyn's eyes then found Charles. You're still here too. I'm not going anywhere. Even if I told you to leave, even then, you're stuck with me now, for better or for worse. He paused. Well, we've already done worse. Maybe it's time we try for better. Evelyn let out a small laugh, then winced in pain. Don't make me laugh. It hurts. Sorry. Charles moved a bit closer, careful not to crowd her, knowing Diane was watching his every move. The doctor said you need rest and no stress, so I'm going to make sure you get it. Whatever you need, whatever will help, you just have to tell me. What I need, Evelyn said slowly, is to know that you're serious, that this isn't just some reaction out of guilt or panic, that when things get hard again and you know they will, you're not going to just disappear. Charles pulled a chair over, sat down, and looked her directly in the eyes. I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone, not even you, something I've always been too ashamed to admit. Evelyn just waited, her expression cautious. When I was 12, my dad had a heart attack, a massive one. We were just having a normal family dinner, and he just collapsed on the floor. My mom was screaming. I ran to get help, but I was too slow, too panicked. I didn't know what to do. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. He died right there on the kitchen floor while I just stood there, completely useless. Charles's voice trembled, but he pushed on. After that day, I promised myself I would never be helpless like that again. I would never be in a situation where I couldn't control what happened. So I built a business empire, made a lot of money, gained power. I convinced myself that if I was successful enough, nothing bad could ever touch me. Diane made a soft noise, but Charles kept his eyes locked on Evelyn. But the more I got, the more terrified I became, because I knew it was all fake. I couldn't control any of the things that actually mattered. So when our marriage started to have problems, when you needed me to be there for you emotionally, and I just didn't know how, I ran. I chose being lonely over being vulnerable, because lonely felt so much safer, and I've been running away ever since. He took a shaky breath. But watching you almost die today, watching you fight for your life twice in 3 days, I realized something. I feel like that 12-year-old kid again, just watching helplessly as someone I love disappears. But this time I get to stay and fight. To be brave enough to love you even if I lose you, Kasiko. Evelyn's face was wet with tears. Charles, you don't have to say a thing. You don't have to forgive me or take me back. I just needed you to understand why I left, and why I'm here now, and why I am never leaving again, no matter what. He roughly wiped his own eyes. I'm just sorry it took me almost losing you to finally get it. I am so sorry I wasted all that time being a coward. Evelyn reached for his hand and held it weakly. I'm sorry about your father. You never told me that story. I've never told anyone. It felt like admitting I failed, like I just was not strong enough. Charles gave a bitter laugh. It turns out that keeping secrets doesn't make you strong at all. It just makes you lonely. Diane cleared her throat. I am going to give you two a little privacy. Evelyn, I will be back in the morning. And Charles, she pointed right at him. If you mess this up, I will personally throw you off the Space Needle. Is that clear? Crystal clear. She left, closing the door gently. Charles and Evelyn just sat there in silence, holding hands. They listened to the steady beep of the heart monitor that had terrified Charles only minutes before. I don't know if I can trust you again, Evelyn finally said. I want to, but I'm just not sure I can. I know. I don't blame you. I haven't earned it yet, but I'm going to. Charles squeezed her hand gently. One day at a time, and one decision at a time. I am going to keep showing up until you either believe me or I die trying. That is a little dramatic. Well, I'm a dramatic guy. Apparently. Who knew? He managed a small smile. Now get some rest. Doctor's orders. I'll be right here when you wake up. You can't stay here all night. The nurses are going to kick you out. Then I will sleep in the waiting room, or in my car, or on the front steps. But I am not leaving this building while you and Rowan are inside it. Evelyn studied his face for a long moment, looking for something. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, because she gave a small nod. Okay, but Charles, if you are going to stay, then actually stay. Don't sit out there making business deals on your phone and pretending to be present. Either be here or don't. No half measures. No half measures, Charles agreed. I promise. She closed her eyes and the exhaustion just pulled her under. Within minutes, she was fast asleep. Charles just sat there, watching her breathe, watching the monitors, making sure her heart kept beating. He'd never been a religious man, but he found himself praying to anyone who might be listening. Please let her be okay. Please give me one more chance to make this right. Please don't take her from Rowan, or from me. A nurse came in quietly, checked on Evelyn's vitals, and gave Charles a sympathetic look. You should get some rest, too, Mr. Burden. This is going to be a long road. How long, realistically? The nurse hesitated. It depends. If her heart responds to the treatment, she could go home in a week or two. But her recovery will take months, maybe even a year. She will need help at home, especially with the baby. No heavy lifting, no stress, and careful monitoring. It is going to be hard. I can do hard. I am good at hard. Charles stood up and stretched his aching back. Can I check on Rowan before the visiting hours are over? Of course. He's doing great, by the way. He gained 2 ounces today. That is excellent progress for a preemie his size. Charles walked back to the NICU, his body completely exhausted, but his mind wide awake. Rowan was awake, his tiny eyes open, just staring at nothing and everything all at once. Charles washed his hands, slid them into the porthole, and touched his son's unbelievably soft skin. Hey, buddy, it's been a big day, huh? Your mom scared us pretty bad, but she's going to be okay. She is so tough, your mom. The toughest person I know. He swallowed hard. I am going to take care of both of you. I do not know how yet, but I'm going to figure it out. That is what dads are supposed to do, right? They figure things out. His phone buzzed. Charles pulled it out and saw a text from Jennifer. The board meeting has been rescheduled for Monday. They want you there. Marcus says it's important. Charles just stared at the message. Monday was 4 days away. 4 days to be here, to be present, to prove to Evelyn and himself that he had actually changed. But that board meeting was important too. Major investors were going to be there. Decisions about the company's future and his future. He typed back, "Tell them I am out. Effective immediately. Marcus can take over as the CEO." Jennifer's response was almost instant. Are you sure? This is a huge decision. Charles looked at Rowan, at his tiny son, just fighting to grow and breathe and simply exist. Yes, I am sure. Some things matter more than business. He turned off his phone, put it away in his pocket, and focused completely on Rowan. Time passed, an hour, maybe 2. Charles talked about nothing and everything. He told stories about Evelyn, about their early days, the first time they met at a fundraiser, how she called his tie hideous, and how he fell in love on the spot. He told stories about his own childhood, his dad teaching him to fish, about dreams he once had and lost, and was now finding again. A security guard appeared at the door. "Sir, visiting hours ended 30 minutes ago. I am going to have to ask you to leave." Charles looked up. His face must have shown something, because the guard's expression softened. "I am sorry. It is hospital policy. You can come back at 7 tomorrow morning." Charles nodded, giving Rowan's hand one last gentle touch. "I will be back, little man. First thing, I promise." He left the NICU, walked past Evelyn's room where she slept peacefully, and headed for the exit. But he stopped at the front doors. He just couldn't make himself leave, couldn't put any distance between himself and the two people who mattered the most. So he went to the parking garage, grabbed blankets and a pillow from the emergency kit in his car, came back to the hospital, and made himself as comfortable as he could on a bench in the main lobby. The night guard gave him a strange look but did not say a word. Charles did not care. He was staying. He had promised. Around 3 in the morning, someone sat down right next to him. Charles opened his eyes, expecting another security guard telling him to move along. Instead, he saw Marcus Chen, looking rumpled and tired in just jeans and a sweatshirt. "What are you doing here?" Charles asked. "I could ask you the same thing." Marcus held out a cup of coffee. "But I think I already know the answer. You are keeping watch." Charles gratefully took the coffee. "Something like that. Jennifer told me what you did, stepping down as CEO. That is huge. It is overdue." They sat in silence for a while, just drinking coffee under the fluorescent lights of a hospital lobby at 3 in the morning. Finally, Marcus spoke. "I am getting divorced. Again. Meredith served me the papers yesterday. She says I care more about work than our marriage, and she is right. Obviously, I do, or
I did.
I do not know anymore." Charles looked at his friend. He really looked at him. He saw the exhaustion, the loneliness, the slow dawning realization that success was not enough. "So, what are you going to do?" "I do not know. Fight for her, maybe, if she will let me. Or let her go and just keep building the empire. Both options sound pretty terrible." Marcus rubbed his face. "How did you know?" "How did you know when it was finally time to stop running?" "I did not know. Life just hit me so hard that I couldn't run anymore. It forced me to stand still long enough to see everything I had lost." Charles gestured vaguely at the hospital around them. "I am not sure I would recommend my method. Nearly losing 2 people you love is one hell of a wake-up call. But you are here now. That has to count for something. Maybe. Ask me again in 6 months when Evelyn has decided if she can forgive me." Charles finished his coffee and crumpled the cup. "You should go home, Marcus. Get some sleep. Fight for your marriage if that is really what you want. Just do not wait until it is too late like I did." Marcus stood up and clapped Charles on the shoulder. "For what it is worth, I think you are doing the right thing. Stepping down, being here, all of it. Thanks. That means a lot." Marcus left. Charles lay back down on the uncomfortable bench, pulled the blanket over himself, and tried to get some sleep. His back ached, and his neck was cramping. He had never been more uncomfortable in his entire life, but he was here. He was staying. And that had to count for something. At 6:30 in the morning, a different security guard woke him up. "Sir, you need to move. The morning shift is starting, and this bench is in the way." Charles sat up, feeling disoriented, every single muscle protesting. "What time is it?" 6:35. Visiting hours start in 25 minutes. Charles folded his blankets, went to the bathroom to wash his face and try to look a little more presentable, bought more coffee from a vending machine, and was waiting outside the NICU when the doors opened at exactly 7. Rowan was awake, alert, and almost seemed to be waiting for him. Charles smiled and slid his hands through the porthole. "Good morning, son. I told you I would be back." He spent an hour with Rowan and then went to check on Evelyn. She was also awake, eating breakfast and looking much stronger. Her face lit up when she saw him, but then it immediately fell. "Did you sleep here?" she asked, taking in his rumpled suit, his unshaven face, and the pure exhaustion in his eyes. "In the lobby, on a bench. It was the most uncomfortable night of my life, actually. But I stayed." He grinned just a little. "No half measures, remember?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "You are an idiot. We have already established this. A complete and total idiot who slept on a bench in a hospital lobby instead of going to his penthouse with those 1,000 thread count sheets. The bench was closer to you and Rowan. That made it the better option. She shook her head, but she was smiling, actually smiling at him. Come here. Charles moved toward her cautiously. Evelyn reached out and touched his face, her fingers gentle on his stubbled jaw. You look terrible. Thanks. You look beautiful. You're a liar. But she was smiling a little. Charles, I can't promise that this will work. I mean. I can't promise I can forgive you completely, or that we'll get back together. But I am willing to try, to let you be in Rowan's life, and see if maybe we can rebuild some trust. That's all I want, a chance. Charles covered her hand with his own. One day at a time, we'll figure it all out. One day at a time, she agreed. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the future didn't feel so scary. It felt like something worth fighting for. The next 2 weeks were a crash course for Charles in what truly mattered in life. He learned that Rowan needed a bottle every 3 hours. That changing a diaper required more precision than closing a $40 million deal. The sound of his son crying cut him deeper than any business failure ever had. He learned Evelyn took her heart medicine at 8, noon, and 4, and that she couldn't climb stairs without getting winded. Some days she was so tired she could barely hold her eyes open, but she still forced herself to go to the NICU to hold Rowan. He learned what it really meant to show up every morning. At 7, Charles was at the hospital. Every night, he was the last one to leave. He brought Evelyn breakfast from her favorite cafe, not the hospital cafeteria. He sat with her during doctors' meetings, taking notes and asking the questions she was too exhausted to ask herself. He memorized medication times, learned medical terms, and became fluent in the language of heart failure and newborn care. But it was the little moments that completely broke him down and then built him back up. Like the day Evelyn cried because she couldn't shower alone and the nurse was busy. Charles helped her, keeping his eyes down, holding her steady, his heart breaking at how fragile she had become. Or the day Rowan finally opened his eyes and seemed to really see Charles for the first time. Charles just stood there in the NICU, sobbing, while the nurses kindly pretended not to see. On day 12, the NICU doctor pulled Charles aside with news that made his chest feel tight. Rowan's ready to come out of the incubator, Dr. Patterson said with a smile. He's keeping his temperature steady, breathing well, and gaining weight. We're moving him to an open bassinet, which means you can finally hold him. Charles felt like his knees were about to give out. I can hold my son? You can hold your son. It happened that afternoon. Evelyn watched from a wheelchair the nurses brought for her, her face glowing despite how tired she was. Dr. Patterson showed Charles how to support Rowan's head and cradle him correctly, then placed 4 pounds of a living, breathing miracle into his arms. Time just stopped. Charles looked down at Rowan's tiny face, at his unfocused eyes, at perfect little fingers wrapping around his thumb, and he felt every wall he'd ever built completely shatter. This was his son, his child, a person who would need him for everything, who would learn how to be a person by watching him. He deserved so much better than the father Charles had been. Hey, little man, Charles whispered, his voice cracking. I'm your dad. I know we had a rough start, but I'm here now. I am probably going to mess up a lot. I'm going to make mistakes, but I promise you, I will always be here for you. I will always fight for you, and I will love you more than I ever thought possible. Evelyn was crying. Charles was crying. Even one of the nurses was dabbing her eyes. Rowan just stared up at Charles with his blurry newborn eyes and yawned, totally unimpressed. Can Evelyn hold him? Charles asked. Is she strong enough? Dr. Patterson looked unsure. Her heart is still very weak. The weight might be too much of a strain. Please, Evelyn begged, her voice filled with desperation. Please, I need to hold my son. I've waited for so long. So, they compromised. Evelyn stayed in the wheelchair with pillows propped all around her, and Charles carefully placed Rowan into her arms. The second their son was settled on her chest, Evelyn's face completely changed. It was pure joy, pure love, and pure relief that she'd made it that they both had. Hi, baby, she whispered, kissing Rowan's forehead. Hi, sweet boy. Mama's here. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry I couldn't hold you sooner. But I'm here now. We're both here. Charles watched them and felt something click into place inside his chest. This was his family. It was broken and complicated and held together with hope and sheer will, but it was his, and he would do anything to keep them safe. 2 days later, Evelyn was discharged. The doctors wanted her nearby for observation, so she couldn't go back to her old apartment. She couldn't handle stairs or be too far from a hospital. Charles solved the problem the only way he knew how. He rented a ground-floor apartment just 3 blocks from the hospital. He had it furnished in a single day and hired a nurse to stay with Evelyn when he had to be at the NICU with Rowan. He moved his own stuff from the penthouse, leaving Siena's things in boxes in the lobby for her to pick up. He never looked back. Diane helped Evelyn move in, watching Charles closely as he worried over the bed placement, stocked the kitchen with foods for her special diet, and checked the temperature. "You're really doing this," Diane said, as a statement, not a question. "I'm really doing this," Charles confirmed. "And when the novelty wears off? When it's 3 in the morning and Rowan has been crying for 2 hours and Evelyn's too weak to help? What happens then?" Charles met her gaze directly. "Then I handle it, because that's what a parent does. That's what I should have been doing from the start." Diane studied him for a long moment and then slowly nodded. "Okay, but I'm watching you. We all are." "Good. I would be worried if you weren't." That first night in the apartment, Evelyn sat on the couch wrapped in blankets, too exhausted to do anything but breathe. Charles made her tea just the way she liked it, with honey and lemon, and sat across from her, giving her space. "This is weird," Evelyn finally said. "Us here, co-parenting, whatever this is, it's just weird." "It's weird," Charles agreed, "but it also feels right, doesn't it?" Evelyn sipped her tea thinking, "I don't know yet. Ask me in a month, or 6 months, or a year. I'm taking this one day at a time, remember?" "One day at a time," Charles repeated. But that night, when Evelyn's heart monitor blared at 2 in the morning because her heart rate spiked, Charles was there. He called the on-call cardiologist, helped Evelyn back to bed, and sat with her until her breathing was steady and the panic left her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered as he left her room. "For being here, for not running." "I'm never running again," Charles told her. "You're stuck with me now, whether you like it or not." She smiled, just a little. "I'm starting to think I might like it. Maybe." 3 weeks after Rowan was born, the NIC team decided he was finally ready to go home. Charles and Evelyn went to the final meeting together, both of them terrified and unbelievably excited. "He's at 5 pounds now," Dr. Patterson said, beaming. "Excellent weight gain. His breathing is strong. He hasn't had any apnea spells in over a week. All his tests are normal. I see no reason to keep him here any longer. You two are taking home a healthy baby boy." Tears were streaming down Charles's face, and he didn't even try to hide them. "We can take him home today? Today. We'll give you instructions for feeding, medications, and what to watch for. But yes, today." Evelyn grabbed Charles' hand and squeezed it tight. They had been touching more often lately. Small gestures of comfort of being in this together. It wasn't romantic, but it felt like the start of something new. The discharge process took hours, forms to sign, instructions to learn, and a car seat inspection to make sure Charles had installed it right. He had even bought a safer, sensible sedan instead of his Tesla just for this purpose. Finally, a nurse wheeled Evelyn out while Charles carried Rowan in his car seat, moving as if he were carrying something priceless. They strapped Rowan into the back. Charles drove 5 miles under the speed limit, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, while Evelyn sat twisted in her seat, watching Rowan as if he might vanish. "He's okay," Charles said, trying to soothe her and himself. "He's fine. We're almost there. I know. I just can't stop staring. I can't believe he's ours, that we actually get to take him home." They pulled into their apartment's parking lot, and Charles carried Rowan inside. Evelyn followed slowly, her hand on her chest. The nurse Charles hired, Patricia, had put up "Welcome Home" balloons and a banner that made Evelyn cry. "Welcome home, baby Rowan," Patricia said warmly. "The nursery is all set, formula is ready, and I made you both dinner. It's nothing fancy, but it's hot." Charles could have kissed her. Instead, he just thanked her over and over, paid her double, and asked if she could please come back tomorrow to help them get into a routine. That first night was pure chaos. It was beautiful and terrifying. Rowan cried at 8, at 11, at 2, and again at 4. Charles and Evelyn took turns stumbling around the apartment, completely exhausted. They tried to remember what the nurses in the NICU taught them about burping and swaddling. By 5 in the morning, both parents were wide awake and crying. Rowan was crying. Everyone was crying. It was a symphony of total exhaustion and new parent panic. "I don't know what I'm doing," Evelyn sobbed, patting Rowan's back with no effect. "I can't get him to calm down. I'm already a terrible mother." "You are not terrible. He's just adjusting. We're all adjusting." Charles took Rowan and carefully bounced him, just like Patricia showed them. He made these shushing sounds that felt silly, but somehow they actually worked. Rowan's screams quieted down to whimpers, and then silence. He was fast asleep on Charles's chest in just minutes. "How did you do that?" Evelyn asked, totally amazed and maybe a little jealous. "Pure luck. It was just dumb luck." Charles swayed gently, afraid that any sudden move would wake Rowan up again. "We are going to figure this out together. That's what matters, right? We are not doing this alone anymore." Evelyn wiped her eyes and nodded. "Together." I liked the sound of that. They just stood there in the dark nursery, with Rowan sleeping peacefully after all the chaos. And in that moment, Charles felt something inside him change. This was a family. It was messy and imperfect, held together by sheer desperation and love, but it was family. The days all blurred into one long cycle of feedings, diapers, and doctor's appointments for both Evelyn and Rowan. Charles learned to survive on 3 hours of sleep. He learned how to make a bottle with one hand while holding a crying baby. He learned that sometimes the very best parenting advice was just to survive the moment and try again the next day. He also learned exactly what Evelyn had been going through all by herself. Her heart medication made her dizzy. She couldn't lift anything heavier than Rowan, which meant Charles had to do all the cooking, all the cleaning, and all the laundry. Some days her chest pains were so bad she couldn't even get out of bed. On those days, Charles would bring Rowan to her so she could at least hold him while he handled everything else. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said one afternoon, watching Charles fold laundry with Rowan bouncing in a carrier on his chest. "I'm so sorry you have to do all of this. I feel so useless." "You are not useless. You are recovering. There is a very big difference." Charles put down a tiny baby shirt and looked right at her. "Evelyn, you almost died bringing our son into the world. Your heart is literally broken from creating life. You get to rest. You get to heal. I can handle everything else. But you are so exhausted. You are doing everything. I am doing what I should have been doing from the very beginning. Better late than never, right?" He gave her a small smile. "Besides, I think I'm actually pretty good at laundry. Who knew?" 6 weeks after Rowan came home, Charles got a call from Marcus. "The board wants to buy you out," Marcus said, getting straight to the point. "Full value for all your shares, plus a big bonus if you stay on as a consultant. They're worried about the company's stability with you gone." Charles was in the middle of changing a diaper, with the phone on speaker. Rowan was kicking his little legs, cooing. "What do you think I should do? Honestly, you should take the deal. You don't want to be the CEO anymore. You've made that very clear. This way, you get the cash that gets stability, and everybody wins. And you get to be CEO for good. That is the plan," Marcus said, then paused. "If you are okay with that." Charles finished with Rowan's diaper, picked him up, and held him on his shoulder. "I am more than okay with it. You'll be great. You'll probably be better than I ever was. You actually like the business side of things. I was just going through the motions for the last 5 years. So, that's a yes. That is a yes. Send me the paperwork. I will sign whatever you need." He hung up the phone and looked down at Rowan. "Well, buddy, it looks like your old man just became a stay-at-home dad. What do you think about that?" Rowan burped loudly. "I will take that as a yes." Evelyn appeared in the doorway, leaning on the frame for support. "You are really doing this? You're selling your company?" "I technically already did. The papers are being sent over now." Charles bounced Rowan gently. "I do not need the company. I need this. You two are my family. Everything else is just background noise." "Charles, that company was your life's work. You spent 20 years building that empire. You can't just walk away from it because of us." "I'm not walking away because of you. I am walking towards something better," he said, moving closer. "Evelyn, for 20 years I built buildings and I made deals. I got richer and richer, and I was absolutely miserable. I was successful, but miserable. These last 6 weeks, changing diapers, doing laundry, and helping you recover, I have been happier than I have been in my entire life. So yes, I am selling the company, because it was never really mine to begin with. It was just a place for me to hide." Evelyn's eyes started to fill with tears. You are serious? You are really serious about this? About us? I have never been more serious about anything. She moved closer, wrapping her arms around him and Rowan, and pressed her forehead against his shoulder. I'm scared, she whispered. I'm scared to trust this, to trust you. What if you change your mind? What if this is just some phase and in 6 months you hate us for making you give up your career? Then I will deal with it. But Evelyn, I am not going to change my mind. This is not a phase. This is me finally understanding what I should have known this whole time. He kissed the top of her head. I love you. I never stopped loving you. And I know that I destroyed your trust. I know I hurt you in ways that might never completely heal. But I am asking you to please take a chance on me, on us. Let me prove to you that I have changed. She pulled back a little and looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of a lie. Whatever she saw there must have been enough, because she slowly nodded. Okay, we will try. We will really try. Not just being parents together, but being us again. Rebuilding what we once had. We're rebuilding something better. Charles corrected her, because we are not the same people we used to be. We are better and stronger and more honest. And more exhausted, Evelyn added with a little laugh. Definitely more exhausted. Rowan picked that exact moment to start crying, demanding their attention. He reminded them their romantic moment was officially over, and it was time to be parents again. They both laughed, which broke the tension, and moved together to take care of their son. 3 months later, Charles and Evelyn sat in a cardiologist's office, holding hands. They were waiting for test results that would decide the rest of Evelyn's life. The tests were done. The blood work was analyzed. All the data was in. Now, they just had to find out if her heart was healing or if the damage was permanent. Dr. Reyes came in with a folder, her face impossible to read. Charles felt his own heart pound in his chest. Evelyn's hand was shaking in his. So, Dr. Reyes said, sitting down, I have your results. The silence in the room felt endless. Charles felt like he couldn't breathe. Your heart function has improved significantly, Dr. Reyes said, and Charles felt Evelyn just melt with relief next to him. You are at 45% ejection fraction now. You were at 20% when you came in. That is a remarkable recovery. The medication is working. The rest is working. Whatever you are doing, keep doing it. Does this mean I'm healed? Evelyn asked, her voice full of hope. It means you are healing. You are not at normal function yet, which would be 55 to 60%, but you are moving in the right direction. If you continue with the treatment and lifestyle changes, there is a very good chance you will reach normal function within another year. Evelyn burst into tears. Charles pulled her close, his own eyes getting misty. The relief was so intense it almost hurt. She was going to be okay. They were going to be okay. Can I ask what changed? Dr. Reyes looked from one to the other. Your recovery is much faster than I ever expected. Evelyn looked over at Charles and smiled through her tears. I stopped trying to do everything all by myself. I let someone else help me. I let myself be taken care of. And I stopped running, Charles added. I started showing up. I started fighting. Doctor smiled. Well, whatever it is working. Keep it up. I will see you again in 3 months. They left the office in a daze, got into the car, and just sat there for a minute, letting it all sink in. Patricia was watching Rowan back at home. They had about an hour before they needed to be back. It was 1 hour to just be Charles and Evelyn, not parents or patients. Just two people who had found their way back to each other through chaos and loss and sheer determination. I love you, Evelyn said suddenly. I do not think I have said that out loud since you came back, but I do. I love you, Charles. Even though you broke my heart, and even though we're still rebuilding some trust, I love you. Charles felt his chest just open up. I love you too. I never stopped, even when I pretended I had. I love you and Rowan more than I ever thought was possible to love anything. So, what do we do now? Evelyn asked. Charles thought about the empty space on Evelyn's finger where a wedding ring used to be, about the finalized divorce papers, the life they'd torn down, and the new one they were building from the ashes. I don't know, he said honestly. Maybe we date, take it slow, do it right this time. Or we just keep raising Rowan together day by day. What do you want? Evelyn spoke so slowly. I want to not rush into anything. To make sure this is real, she said. To make sure we're not just trauma bonded or only doing this for Rowan. I want to fall in love with you all over again. Intentionally this time, with our eyes open. Then that's what we'll do. Charles lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. I can wait. I have got the rest of my life to prove I am worth the risk. They drove home together and walked into the apartment. Patricia was rocking Rowan to sleep. Baby toys were scattered on the floor, bottles waited by the sink, and laundry needed to be folded. Life was messy and beautiful and real. Charles took Rowan from Patricia, held his son close, and felt Evelyn lean on his shoulder, exhausted but healing, broken but rebuilding. This was his family. This was what mattered. Not empires or wealth or power, but this tiny apartment filled with the people he loved. This was a chance to do everything right, the second time around. Hey, little man, Charles whispered to Rowan, who slept peacefully in his arms. Your mom's getting better. Your parents are figuring things out, and we're all going to be okay. I promise you that. We're going to be more than okay. Evelyn kissed Charles's shoulder, a gentle gesture that held the promise of more to come. We're going to be happy, she said. Actually happy, all three of us. And standing there in their small apartment, holding their son, rebuilding their love one honest moment at a time, Charles Burton finally understood what he had been searching for his entire life. Not success or wealth or power, but simply this: the courage to stay, the strength to love, and the wisdom to know that just showing up was the most important thing he would ever do.